How do you think U.S. government right now looks at the Intermarium? Is there any talk? Of course, there must be some talk. How realistic it is that the United States will actually support this, given the Polish government and the President Duda right now, which we see is traveling to these regions, and there's possibly, he actually said that he thinks about building this the relationship between the countries which are between Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. So given that there is a will on Polish part and all the countries' part, what do you think? How do you think the United States is looking at this?
Well, I think the United States currently ignores this completely, except for elements in the intelligence community and the Pentagon that I work with. Otherwise, it's either a joke or complete unknown. I think the current government is sounding out the Kremlin to make some kind of a deal because of Putin's involvement in Syria. Until the Intermarium organizes itself, by which I mean it cannot be a Polish initiative, because anything the Poles do is viewed by everyone else as imperialism, until the Intermarium sticks together and until there is a change of regime in DC. I don't see any hope of official American support. Also, there is no Polish lobby except me at the Institute of World Politics. Nobody talks about anything like this. The Polish-American Congress is not interested. None of the organizations have presence. DC is convinced that everything is honky-dory, and that place between the Baltic and Black Seas and the Adriatic completely doesn't matter. Remember, empires like to talk to empires, so DC would love to go to bed with Moscow. And there have already been, and I mean it, there have already been trial balloons. Oh, Putin is in Syria. Let's see if we can do business. If we do business, that means Yalta too. There already have been attempts, so-called reset, under Hillary Clinton and the first Obama administration. So until the Intermarium organizes itself, and until there is a change of regime in DC, and until there's some kind of an Intermarium lobby, I will be basically the only one talking about it. We do have people who are interested, but they're not elected officials. They're specialists, but they're not your mainstream foreign policy experts.
Lech Kaczyński, Polish president, actually wanted to start this. He went to the countries, he went to Georgia, where he said Ukraine is next and there might be Poland. Right now it seems that Ukraine is in a very difficult situation. In current state, do you think it's possible to build Intermarium without the Ukraine?
I think you'll be surprised, but the most vociferous voices in favor of the Intermarium and restoring Rzecz Pospolita are from Kiev. They are scared out of their wits. So they've brought up the past, they've brought up the old Respublika, the Commonwealth, and they've brought up the Intermarium. There are even people in Kiev working conceptually on the concept. The Poles tend to think that the Ukrainians would like the Poles to pull their chestnuts out of the fire for them. They think that the Ukrainians now are so desperate, they would like to drag Poland in. So that is also not a good situation. But I don't expect a good situation ever to develop. Obviously, we're in a state of crisis. This needs to be addressed. And my solution is American leadership. Because then we can use an American umbrella to build up the economy, which is the key to power. Create some kind of a free trade zone. Pull other people in, including the ones who have been left behind or left outside. And figure things out. For instance, I don't think there should be a EU border between Poland and Belarus. They should come as often as frequently trading and moving back and forth, even from Königsberg, Kaliningrad. This should be open. We need to infect them with freedom. We don't need to contain them. And in fact, we should be containing the Russians with freedom. We should be talking about decentralization of the empire. Yes, when I was asked before Obama sent an ambassador to Moscow before his hearings in the Senate. I was asked, well, what should we ask the ambassadorial nominee? And I said, well, tell him that there is more than one building in Russia, because all American diplomats see is the Kremlin. They should be going to other cities, Kazan, Vladivostok, everywhere else. This whole post-Soviet entity ought to be decentralized, not to collapse, because then we don't want the Chinese to knock on our doors. But we should encourage freedom in the post-Soviet zone everywhere, not just Belarus and Ukraine. But that's the next step.
In your lecture, you mentioned that Poland was always about love, not fire and
No, I didn't say
sword.
it was always about love, but that they preferred
We preferred this way.
to love over
Do you think
conversion with fire and sword. That's the Teutonic way.
if Central and Eastern European countries will sit down and talk about creating this Commonwealth, if we may call it, do you think there should be a dominant state, or we show all equal partners?
If it makes everybody feel better, let's just put the capital of it in Macedonia or Slovakia. It's not a big deal. It's quite natural that the nation with the best laws and the best economy will be dominant. Remember, the Lithuanians got their own parliament because they wanted their own Sejm. They wanted their own separate army. And when I say Lithuanians, of course, I mean Ruthenians, because most of that state was Ruthenian. The most important thing is that this whole thing is well organized, and that there is a spirit of victory, not a spirit of defeat. Because when you go to visit with the slaves, former slaves of the Soviet Empire, even victims of the Nazis and the communists, oftentimes you hear, oh, it's a good idea, but we can't do anything. Nie, dobry pomysł, nie da się nic zrobić. Well, why don't you move your butt and try to do something? Then we'll talk whether you can do it or not. I was taught at home that we try 1,000 times before anything works out, ever. Nothing comes easy in life, not unless you steal.
Europe seems to be in trouble right now. Russia is busy. All we need is the United States. According to the divide and conquer, maybe it's a good time for Poland to think about creating such a state or such an alliance with the countries. Now, it would be great to hear from you. How do you think things will evolve in the near future?
My crystal ball,
yes,
Kazakhstan. Putin said last year, Kazakhstan is not really a state. And when Nazarbayev dies, who knows what's going to happen? So don't expect linear expansion, because imperialism is a crime of opportunity. They will look into Central Asia also because the Chinese have been pushing into Central Asia. So I'm not saying that Tallinn will fall tomorrow. Although if I think it's called Leningrad military district outside of St. Petersburg, it's still called, the district is called Leningrad. I think they have something like 120,000 troops, if not 200,000, the Russians. And the entire Estonian forces, I don't know, 8,000? So give or take 3 hours to Tallinn. However, so long as the United States provides leadership and there is resolve, the Russians will not expand. When it was signaled to the Kremlin that it was okay to take Ukraine or the Crimean Peninsula, when it was signaled for a State Department idiot told the Soviets that the United States didn't really care about Korea, Stalin gave a green light to Kim Il-sung to invade. So a lot hinges upon what the United States will do. However, in Central Asia, the influence of the United States is greatly diminished. The more we withdraw from Afghanistan, the less interests. We have already evacuated our bases, for instance, from Kyrgyzstan. We still have a couple of places, including in Kazakhstan, but really, I can tell you this. I predicted in my book called the Intermarium, which I published in 2012, that Putin would embark, or was already on the path of imperial expansion. I've been watching the developments, and since the Bush 1 administration rejected, and Clinton administration also agreed with Bush 1, rejected any form of decentralizing of the post-Soviet heart, that is what became the Russian Federation. Decentralizing, not destroying. I knew that once the Russians put their house in order, more or less, it would be along the Byzantine, Caesaro-Papist and Mongol ways, and they would start reintegrating. That's just inexorable logic of history. We had a national security siesta, both on the Republican and Democrat side. When, for instance, my friends and colleagues would go to testify in Congress about what the Moscow leaders were up to, nobody wanted to hear it, not even believe it. We'd say, look, they're taking our assistance to dismantle their nuclear weapons. Instead, they have created a new generation of rockets. Crickets, no reaction. The year of our Lord 1998, national security fiesta. I don't think there would have been a difference in DC, in Washington DC, had there been a Republican administration in place. Why? Because the establishment believed in this garbage of Frank Fukuyama called the end of history. And that was the timber, that was the muzak in the air. Anybody who'd say, hey, history doesn't end, was looked upon as somebody who was rocking the boat. In Poland, anybody who'd say anything advising prudence and far-sighted strategy was called oszomom. Same muzak in the air in Washington, D.C. It's the same thing.
Question number one, what are the chances of a conflict between Russia and China right now? And what was Russian spies' aims, influence on the U.S. declining support to Ukraine in the 1990s and early 2000s?
So you're talking about political operations, political warfare and influence operations. Okay. So now the prospect of conflict of China. In the long run, there cannot be great China with great Russia. So they are already in conflict. It just hasn't come out because both view as the main enemy the United States. For instance, if you look at either Russia's or China's military doctrine, and they publish those every year or so, main enemy, China, United States. Main enemy, Russia, NATO, which means the United States. That's what their military doctrine says. That means they won't clash openly in the predictable future so long as they see the United States as the main enemy, as a force uniting them in all their lack of affinity for one another. For your average Russian, China is abhorrent. The United States is viewed as a lightweight, basically as San Francisco writ large. But China is a threat and it's abhorrent. They don't act on it. However, sometimes they make noises. Some of the noises concern Central Asia and Chinese influences. Much of infrastructure, for instance, have you been to Western China and Central Asia? Well, much of infrastructure is built by the Chinese. The Russians don't like it, except Moscow was unable to build the infrastructure. Well, the Chinese were. There is some kind of a tacit agreement that Chinese seasonal workers can come to Siberia, but they can't bring women with them. There are illegal China towns in most Siberian towns. They're illegal because they shouldn't be there, and Russians ever so often eject them and complain bitterly about those. There is Chinese presence. Demographically speaking, there are about, I think, 60 at least million Chinese, facing about 8 million Soviets or post-Soviets of various ethnicities, Russian-speaking, in that part of the world. The place is depopulated, very harsh living. The most daunting element of existence there is mosquitoes during the summer. I'd be surprised, but that's what it is. The Chinese don't pay promptly. That's why, despite Moscow's noises that would redirect the flow of gas and oil to China, they're not doing it. Remember, China has a law. If you ship a container of your chocolates to China, the minute the ship docks in a Chinese port, the chocolates are not yours. You can never be guaranteed that you'll be ever paid for them. So the Russians are afraid if they build a whole infrastructure, even with Chinese assistance, into China, who's going to pay them? There is another problem. The Russians resent the Chinese as interlopers in Central and Eastern Europe. The Chinese attempted to move into Poland, but they were lackluster in their endeavors, mostly for reasons of bungling. Communist governor of a province in China showed up in Warsaw. Mind you, the province had a yearly budget of $100 billion. And the foreign ministry and other bozos sent them to Lublin because they thought, hey, here's Voyevoda, there's Voyevoda. A provincial governor here, a provincial governor there. Let them talk to each other. So, also the Chinese, when they attempted to build freeways, thought Poland was Angola, because they bumped usually into stupid people from the government, and began treating everybody as they do in Zambia or Angola. And the Poles said, oh yeah, take a hike. And the Chinese thought all they have to do was roll out some money. But that didn't work. So there was a cultural clash. The Chinese recoiled, relocated their center to Hungary and Slovakia. They're huge hubs. When you go outside of Warsaw, there is a huge shopping center, which is mostly Chinese and Vietnamese run. The Chinese use it as a springboard of their influence, but it's not. It's a self-enclosed ghetto rather than an opportunity to project Chinese economic interests, because they got burned and they are confused. Had they operated with within the free market with people who actually want to make money, there would have been probably some mutual cooperation, but they would have to stop treating the Poles the way they treat Africans. And the people who were dispatched from China, the secret policemen, to set up that kind of enterprise, were not sophisticated enough. And then the official Ministry of Foreign Affairs and official people who greeted the Chinese on some other occasions misunderstood the Chinese culture and didn't know how to deal with it. There are very few people in Poland qualified to deal with China. One of them is a kid, a friend of mine, younger friend of mine I work with. His name is Radek Pifel. He studied in China. I think he lived there for 8 years. He understands everything. Not a chance for employment in the foreign ministry because he's neither a liberal nor a communist. So he just lingers there and operates a website. See, you asked me a question, I answered truthfully. I'm the only person with no security clearance, I stress. So I can talk to you if I want to talk to you. And if I'm told to talk to you, that means I can divulge things that are not easily obtainable. As far as the 80s and 90s, remember, transformation meant that the communists retained everything, almost everything economically and politically in their hands. And transformation also meant that Gorbachev, until almost the very end, thought he could save communism. He didn't launch his perestroika and glasnost to destroy the Soviet Union. He launched to reform it. So very many, if not most, were shocked that the result was what it was. The influence operations changed. The influence operations were predicated first and foremost on duping the West about the situation in the Soviet Union at its death throes, which were not apparent. For instance, George Bush George Bush delivered the Chicken Kiev speech, famous Chicken Kiev speech, which, by the way, was set up by a cabal of 5 top employees on his National Security Council without consultation without any consultation with anybody else. And it was written by a minor clerk on the National Security Council, because other people said no. One of my very good friends and colleagues quit on principle because of Chicken Kiev speech, because he said, Paul Goebel was his name. He was the Deputy Undersecretary, CIA, but Deputy Undersecretary of State for non-Russian Soviet nationalities. He said, I spent all my life, 40 years, adult years, trying to free the Poles, the Ukrainians and the others from the communist yoke, and you're giving the Chicken Kiev speech where George Bush stood up and appealed to the Ukrainians and others and Lithuanians not to rebel against the communists. The speech was written by a minor clerk. Her name was Condoleezza Rice. She enjoyed a stellar career afterwards, because the mantra of the State Department was stability. And some people read too much Mackinder, a geopolitical guru, and decided that it was best to stick with the Soviet Union. Whereas my friends and colleagues on the National Security Council, people who mentored me, said, no, we drive the stake into the vampire's heart and quarter it and burn it, so there wouldn't be a transformation. Those people lost their jobs. Now, to embarrass publicly the President of the United States, a sitting President of the United States, meant that Paul lost his house, because he quit on principle. He couldn't find a job. He had spent 40 years. This is a person who knows 32 or 37 languages, including Samoyed, Tajik. And he spent his entire life fighting in the trenches to bring freedom to the Intermarium and other people enslaved. So this freedom doesn't come free, including for people who work for a Republican conservative administration. Don't even get me started on how ugly the Byzantine entrails are. When you look from within, it boggles the mind. Influence operations were well, and DC foreign policy wonks, and the Muscovite power structure decided that it would be feasible to let Ukraine go formally, but not informally. The only way it could be guaranteed is that if the Ukrainians gave up their nukes. One of the first things the Intermarium needs to do is get its own nukes. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, as paradoxical as it may sound, thanks to nuclear weapon, we haven't had a major war, a world war. Did you know that the United States gave enriched plutonium to the Japanese in the 60s when Mao was at his worst behavior? And the Japanese still have it. I don't see why the Poles shouldn't have it. Yeah, I've been talking about it forever and ever.
Does it look, in your opinion, that Western Europe is losing its self-preserving instinct? Are they going to wake up, or just be soft and powerful as they try to be so far? Second question, for Poles, young Poles in Poland, how the generations should be educated in order to be set up? Just stick to religious way or nationalistic, or looking into the West, or is there another fourth way to concentrate in education? Thank you.
I'll tell you briefly about what I think as far as Poland. I'm a Jagiellonian nationalist, that is, everybody belongs. If you want to be Polish, the National Democrat Party was chock full of people of Jewish, Scottish, Tatar and other origin, and nobody ever had a problem, so long as you were an endek. They thought racism was some kind of revolutionary, hateful ideology that defied Polish tradition and Christianity. So they didn't care what origin you were of, so long as you were with the Polish nationalists. And if you're a Jagiellonian nationalist, that makes you even more flexible and more people belong. But that entails agreeing on some things that we have in common. That entails not besmirching tradition and history, and not undermining institutions that have kept that place together. You mentioned religion, for example. As far as Western Europe, has it lost its mojo? To a large extent, yes. Once classical liberalism is replaced with libertarianism, that means freedom below the belt. And that's all they care about. And that is simply suicidal. You can't have an entity that dwells under the tyranny of the minorities, however defined or self-defined. It won't survive. You need to have a majority orientation. Now, that said, I will stress once again, there are institutions within the European Union which may be part of the state, which may be part of grassroots endeavor and are outside of the state, that disagree with mainstream opinion generated by the rejects of the anti-cultural revolution of the 1960s, who currently rule the European Union. What I'm referring to is, for instance, the French intelligence and military, who dwell completely outside of the state, yet they are a part of the state. Anytime the French politicians, democratically elected in the parliament, talk about reforms of, say, military intelligence and more civilian oversight, there is a scandal. Oh, every single tabloid in Paris publishes pictures of a culture minister, the nephew of President François Mitterrand, in a brothel with 10-year-old boys in Thailand. It's military intelligence at work. And all talk of reforms disappears. We even had a taste of it here in New York when a candidate of the socialist Strauss-Kahn, who's a libertine, he's a follower of Marquis de Sade, not of Marx, was accused of raping a maid. So it happened that the maid was from Francophone Africa. I'm not saying there was no rape, I'm just explaining to you. It happened that she was from Francophone Africa. She fed the scandal, everything blew up, and then she dropped the charges and disappeared. Was she an officer of French intelligence? Maybe not an officer, but I'm sure that it won't be a surprise to you if I say that the French intelligence did speak to her. And I'll leave it to your imagination, whether it was before or after. So, Danish special forces, stalwart. On the outside, Danish military looks like a bunch of wimps. They elected, for instance, as their union of soldiers, Danish soldiers representative, who said when running for president, he said, first duty of a Danish soldier is to surrender, and I'll make sure that happens. So you think to yourself, oh my God. But then my first cousin, Daniel, is a sergeant, special forces, Danish special forces. He says, okay, he says the libs like this stuff. So it sits well with various leftists, Trotskyites and others, but we do our things. And then he's been deployed a number of times, including 23 combat drops from Mali to Afghanistan, Iraq too. These guys don't joke. And they are untainted by mainstream malaise and the loss. What loss of mojo? If you want to meet him, come for Christmas. He's coming with his kids and wife. Now you can hear eccentric things from him. For instance, he guarded the Mahmoud cartoon guy with his colleagues. This is not mainstream, but these are the people who are willing to give their lives for Denmark. Dutch intelligence and Dutch special forces, very good. In Germany, it's a mixed bag because Germany's military is divided between Atlanticists, who are now in a minority, and Russophiles. So whereas the German military can be all right in terms of its fighting spirit, but not necessarily, the division between the Russophiles and the Atlanticists is a threat to the integrity of the alliance. Don't worry, you won't find it in any newspapers, I'm just telling you. I had a German psych ops officer with a Kościuszko chair, and she specialized in the Cossacks. So I knew about all the divisions between Ukraine blew up and all the personalities. It was fantastic. But I also know about problems of the German military. As far as German civilian power structure, most of them are kumbaya, except in Bavaria, where there are staunch conservatives and Catholics. They are not kumbaya, including as far as their attitude to the wave of migrants that I described. Are not kumbaya. Elsewhere, they sound like the New York Times. Very important. So there are institutions. In Italy, we had something called Gladio. Who has heard about the Gladio? But one person has heard about it, but won't talk of the records. We left an organization in Italy in case of a Soviet occupation behind, which was Italian commandos, Italian military, etc., and intelligence, that is ready to die, and they're still in place. I don't know what they call themselves right now, but there are caches all over Italy, and they are not beyond dirty tricks. For instance, in the 70s, they bombed a train. They bombed a train in Italy, killing people to sway elections so that the electorate would vote for the right. This was during terrorist scare. There are very many things happening that if you don't have a security clearance, you don't know about.
Looking ahead to the Warsaw NATO summit in the summer of 2016, do you think it should be United States policy to persuade United States partners in NATO to permit the permanent stationing of substantial NATO assets on Polish territory, thereby showing United States leadership in the Intermarium to counter Russian resurgent imperialism or revanchism?
Absolutely, yes. So long as the troops are not moved from Germany. The Germans need to know that they lost World War II and they should toe the pro-Atlanticist line. The policy of NATO, of the United States, should remain as it was when at the heyday of the Cold War and NATO. A British aristocrat who happened to be the head of NATO in the 1970s famously remarked, "The objective of NATO and American foreign policy ought to be to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down." I don't think, from the point of view of American interest and the interests of the nations of the Intermarium, this has changed substantially. Absolutely, we should have American troops in Poland. This signifies the same thing as it does in Korea, a tripwire. We have hostages. The American people are always committed to the kids, the GIs. Without them, it's all empty talk. Did you know we didn't have any contingency plans for a Russian invasion of the Baltic states? Until quite recently, no plans. And now we have contingency plans. It doesn't mean we'll do anything, but at least we have contingency plans. And that was only by mistake. President Obama came into basically a war room and said, "Hey, what happens if Russia invades Estonia?" Crickets. He says, "We don't have any plans?" Crickets. "So make them." And he walked away. "No, we have plans." Oh, God. This is called the law of unintended consequences. We have plans, which is fantastic. It is sad, I know. We should have been prepared better, and this should have been in place from the very beginning. But remember, the end of history, peace dividend, love towards everybody.
Is it any possibility to reborn, to reestablish again the same kind of economic cooperation we had under the Soviet Union, but right now to our own benefits? It means our, not Polish, but Intermarium benefits.
The RWPG worked as an internal barter exchange system. I wouldn't call it a market in any shape and form. In fact, the Moscow Center allocated whatever it viewed to be interest of the Soviet Union as far as resources or economic exchanges. For example, the Poles enjoyed primacy on computers till the early 70s when a Polish professor invented a microprocessor. That project was scuttled by the Russians. The Soviets decided it was a horrible idea that the Poles should have it, and the guy became a swineherd. I'm not joking. Yeah. So the hub of communist blocs computer activities was shifted to Bulgaria. That's why some of the best cyber hackers now are in Bulgaria, in the old Soviet bloc, aside from Russia, aside from Moscow. And then Israel and the Philippines that's the succession. Russia, Bulgaria, Israel, and the Philippines. Very many bright, unemployed people. Now, how do you turn this to an advantage? You have to create a common market within a common market. If you get rid of all EU regulations, then it would pay for, say, Macedonians or Slovenes to trade with Poland. If everything goes according to the system, the superstate within the EU, then you'll have more socialism and less incentive to promote exchange between the countries of the former Soviet bloc, including those who are outside the EU. Right now, the only thing that pays is deemed illegal. I'll give you an example. I roam around. I don't have a security clearance. If anybody touches me, the Helsinki Committee, Amnesty International, etc., will be immediately at the throat of whoever touches me. And what I can't do is take pictures, because then I'm a spy. But, for instance, I was in Smolensk shortly after the crash. I walked in and wrote about it a week later, but I can't take pictures. So I don't have picture proof. Because if I'm caught with this, I'm a spy. I decided to find out what the economic exchange routes and means and wares were between Belarus and Poland. So I walked in with cigarette smugglers. They, in front of my very eyes, they dismantled the Polish train. You know, I walked into Lithuania, I walked into Belarus. You can do it following marshlands, just like during the January insurrection or World War II, just marshlands. And if you don't sleep for more than a day at a village that welcomes you, the border guards won't show up. So either KGB or EU border guards from Lithuania. So I decided to walk in and see the black market. They dismantled the Polish train and stashed into that train sacks of cigarettes. The Polish customs officials were able to retrieve, by removing walls and looking under the train, only 20%. I sat there and watched them work. They bribed the Belarusian guards. The Polish guards make too much money, so they weren't bribed. The whole train went in. Then they dismantled it in Białystok. Everybody hopped out. There were already mules and trucks waiting to take it to Germany. There shouldn't be a border. If you get rid of EU regulations, then trade will bloom, also exchanges will happen, but you can't. So the Poles have to be very innovative as far as regulations.
Oh, yeah.
They have to introduce various, well, they have to hire lawyers who understand the system. They have to introduce various gimmicks to overcome the nonsense that the EU regulations created, that thwart free market and freedom. And that'll be a huge trick. Without a counter-revolution, I don't see how this can be accomplished in any shape and form. By this I don't mean violence, I mean counter-revolution in one's head. Remember, the EU originally was conceptualized by monarchists and libertarians at the Mount Pelerin Society, and it included my dinosaurs such as one of my mentors, Eric von Kuhnert-Ledin. And they were thinking about restoring Europe from before 1914. So you would have sovereign nation states, no borders. Anybody could study anywhere one wanted to, or anybody could work anyone one wanted to from within Europe. Not from Burkina Faso, from within our common Latin Christian, as we say in America, Judeo-Christian zone. And it was supposed to be free. Other people at the Mount Pelerin Society were Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises. These were fantastic intellectuals. It all went to hell because the European Union project was hijacked by étatistes. People like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman. They believed in the French model where the state dictates everything. And that cripples the Intermarium, it cripples the whole of Europe. I read an article in the Times of London about EU inspectors descending upon an enterprise in Italy, northern Italy, and slapping it with a fine because its product lacked an expiration date. So guess what the enterprise was? A 10th century Benedictine monastery. What was the product of the Benedictine monastery that lacked a EU expiration, food expiration stamp? Huh?
Brandy?
Beer? No. Beer? Okay. Communion wafers. Ladies and gentlemen. Smash the bureaucrats and the leftists. This is insane. So I said, ooh, that's the Soviet Union. I have a friend, just got out of the hospital, by the way, who sits on our board at the Institute of World Politics. I have to tell you, he is responsible for the heist of the century. He stole 1 million pages from the Kremlin of documents, secret documents. 1 million pages. That's Vladimir Bukovsky, spent 19 years in the Gulag. Vladimir says that the European Union is the new Soviet Union. He's really scared because of that nonsense. And he says, you know, the bureaucrats pretty soon will set up some kind of a police force to enforce this nonsense. Right now there is none, there is no army. But you know, give them time.
They're talking about it.
Yeah, of course they're talking about it. Yes, except I have never met anybody who is willing to die for the euro. I've met people willing to die for the United States, for Poland, etc. For the euro, they would have to invent something. Remember, nihilism is only a preliminary stage to emasculate, to what you said, what you asked me about, to rob the people of the mojo. Nihilism, rób ta co chce ta, nothing matters. Yeah, let's kick religion around, tradition, let's be cynical, and steal as much as we can. This won't last forever. In its place, Vladimir, who's a libertarian, by the way, is ultra-libertarian, to tell you the truth. Vladimir says next step, they'll set up some kind of a police force. And let me put it this way, he's been clairvoyant. I love the 1 million pages he stole, you have no idea.
What are the chances of any of the Western European countries being taken over after this or the next security crisis by a dictatorship related to the military or one of those organizations?
If there is a collapse, the military will step in. I'm sure in France, I mean, we work very close with the French, and they make no bones about the views. They think democracy sucks, but they say, La France, c'est moi. I am France. I'll give you an anecdote, if I may. Of course, I'm making everything up, because I don't have a security clearance, so I can tell you stories that never happened. They never happened. I just like, you know, to make up fairy tales, to give you the flavor of what other people may be or may not be talking about. This is the mid-1980s. The deputy chief of counterintelligence for the CIA was on an operation in France with his French counterpart. To the great horror of the American, the French officers participating in the operation were kidnapping people, putting them illegally in the trunks of their cars, taking them out and putting them on a hot iron, beating them up and basically busting Soviet espionage rings with utmost ferocity. So the American says to his French counterpart, "Oh, gee, at Langley I can't even go to the bathroom without a lawyer." And the Frenchman looked at him and said, "Monsieur, c'est la France." Hasn't changed a bit. So if there is a major collapse, they'll do it. So long as the system putters on, they'll pretend they agree, and they'll do things behind the scenes, and they do awesome things. It behooves us to understand what the system is behind the scenes, because we can work with those people. Fox News is silly when it kicks France around, because the French are some of our best allies. some of our best allies, except in the military and the intelligence. I can give, here I'll declassify something for you from the Cold War. In the mid-1980s, there was a civil war in Chad. N'Djamena was besieged by forces of General Idris, supported by Gaddafi and the French intelligence, military intelligence, which was not exactly congruent with our plans because we were supporting the regime in Chad, which was also thuggish, and we were supporting a Libyan legion to overthrow Gaddafi. Gaddafi demanded of General Idris and his people the head of the Libyan legion and all his people. So we're talking.
From the war against the Chad, right?
We're talking about. He wanted minimum of 5,000 people dead. So the CIA talked to the French intelligence, and when the capital of Chad fell to the rebels, not a single person was killed from the Libyan group. We were able to exfiltrate them all. I'm bringing it up because during the crisis in Darfur, I've mentioned that I deal with mass murder prevention, the State Department, in a sense, complained they couldn't get any traction from France. They couldn't get any traction from France despite the help of the Committee on Conscience at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, because the French refused to help, for they were concerned about what China would do. And China was in bed with the government in Khartoum, so with the government of Sudan, which had unleashed the Janjaweed, Ghost Riders, who are riverine Arabs, against the sub-Saharan Africans. This was, ladies and gentlemen, a race war in Darfur, not a religious war, because all parties involved were Muslims. Don't confuse it with the war in South Sudan, which was the Dinka and Nuer people, Christians and animists against the Muslims. This was a race war. And the advice was to approach the French. And the State Department was incapable because it was only talking to Quai d'Orsay, the foreign ministry. And the key was the intelligence community, except the intelligence community wouldn't talk to the State Department because they consider the State Department a bunch of nincompoops. There are ways to influence things behind the scenes. There was an overlap between the clans in Chad and Darfur. The people who are running that policy were not sophisticated enough to know how to help. It was horrible, because had there been operations behind the scenes, we could have thwarted the mass murder. It wouldn't have gone beyond ethnic cleansing. You could have stopped it, and it degenerated into a borderline genocide. You see what I mean? So I know about those things. I do not know to what extent, for instance, anybody in the power structure in DC is aware of them outside of the intelligence community and the military. Also, I'm pretty sure there is nobody in DC in any official capacity who knows what the Lepanto Foundation is in Italy, in Rome. They're in a very nice 8th century monastery, which used to be a Roman villa. It's headed by a friend of mine. This is the hub of defensive activities in the face of the onslaught by Islam. Nobody knows about it, except when you know. But official Washington just looks away and doesn't care. Professor Roberto Di Mattei, one of the foremost intellectuals in Italy, is the head of it. I asked him, well, so how did you guys find each other? Because it's unusual, no? In Europe. Do you know what the rule is when you belong to the Lepanto Foundation? You are a descendant of one of the people who fought at Lepanto and defeated the Ottoman Empire in 1571. Yes, the tradition remains alive, but it's buried from the face of the era of mass politics, which tends to be nihilistic and besmirches anything that and implies continuity. It's good to dupe the people to think that the past doesn't matter. But it does. It does. And you were asking me before, about non-government organizations. It's one of them. There are numbers of others in France, in England, and elsewhere. But right now we have a situation, such a confusing situation, especially in Western Europe, where the onslaught of outside propaganda causes horrible confusion and disintegration of those societies, including among the elites. I'll give you one example. I have friends, Lord and Lady Belhaven and Stanton. Their lordships like to come to my lectures when I'm in London. So one time, his lordship climbed 3 flights of stairs. He came to see me, and he is a gentleman of a certain age. I think he's the 17th Lord of Belhaven and Stanton. They were ejected, he was ejected forcibly from the House of Lords by that leftist Tony Blair in the late 1990s. Do you know what he and his milieu watch now? To get news, Al Jazeera and Russia Today, because they said the BBC is a communist TV station. And that's horrible. They try to figure things out by watching Russia Today and Al Jazeera. Let me put it this way, it doesn't work out so well for them. I mean, it's better than BBC, but it's still not what it should be. So until the West restores its traditional narrative, until the West rediscovers the source of its strength, it's going to continue to self-cannibalize and be cannibalized itself. And that's just the way it is. And remember what I started with. This was going to be, and it has been, the story of freedom. I started with the Intermarium, but freedom is a universal dimension. In Europe, as far as the current so-called elite, the graduates of the countercultural revolution of the 1960s smirk when I say freedom. They only mean freedom below the belt. Marxism, lesbianism is their ideology. Until Europe wakes up, and I hope it doesn't wake up in an ugly populist way. No Breivik in Norway, and no bombing of immigrants in Sweden, no firebombing immigrants or burning a Jew in effigy in Poland. In Germany, a wave of assaults on immigrants. If there is no leadership from the traditional elite, there will be a wave of populism. You don't want reactionaries like me? That's what you'll get. That's what you'll get. And the nihilists will be sorry because they'll go against the wall first. They will be blamed. Moral relativists and nihilists will be blamed first.
But they will join the revolution.
Well, they'll join anybody. The question is whether the revolution will allow them to be joined.
They will be the most brutal people ever.
That is what some thought in Russia, and the Bolsheviks would have none of them. So that's what they may think, but the revolution doesn't work exactly in a predictable manner. I'll give you an example. One of my mentors, America's foremost red hunter, late Herb Romerstein, was the first who pointed out to me a nexus between former communists and communist sympathizers and the radical caliphatists. He said, look what they're doing here. Why is William Conster at trials of radical caliphatists, Islamists? Why do they enable them? Why do they purvey their propaganda under the false rubric of tolerance? And he showed me the mechanisms. He said, look, the left loves the caliphatists because it wants a revolution, radical left. So the caliphatists, they think, will be a battering ram destroying Western civilization, and then we'll have Pol Pot. I have news. I think ISIS is tougher than the Khmer Rouge. There may, because left radicals can't mobilize the masses. Not too many people among the masses get excited about San Francisco and pedophilia and other pet peeves that the left now has. But the masses, especially Muslim masses in Europe, will get excited and are excited about the message of ISIS. So the left is cutting off the branch we all sit on, as usual, and it won't be able to exploit the Caliphate's onslaught. I can give you another anecdote to illustrate this. A few years ago, I was running around. Well, first time I saw this must have been, geez, I don't want to lie to you, 1990, 92. In the East End, I saw Boycott Israel stickers. East End used to be Sir Oswald Mosley's neighborhood, Union of British Fascists. And now I saw stickers, anti-Jewish stickers, signed by British National Party. I paid attention to it because the head of British National Party, who was kicked out of the British National Party for extremism, Derek Holland, rode a Saddam Hussein tank in the victory parade in Baghdad. It was in 1991. So I started paying attention to this. And I saw in their neighborhoods that there were Middle Eastern males. I thought, gee, skinheads usually beat them up. Sure, they don't like Jews, they don't like foreigners in general. They thought I was pro-EU, so they wanted to beat me up. Because they said I was going to take away their pint and replace it with a half-liter tankard, you know, or in the pub. This is not a joke, they are rather simple people. But they constituted something called the Anti-Zionist International, which was founded by Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and Assad. Yes, also in the underground. Nonetheless, I saw Arabs who were politically involved, Middle Eastern people, in their neighborhoods, which was very unusual. And then, years later, I revisited this thought because, using the jargon of intelligence services, persons of interest who entered the EU disappeared off of the radar of people who work with us. So I thought, where the hell do they go? All the mosques are under surveillance. Community centers are under surveillance. So again, I looked in London, and once again, in those tough skinhead neighborhoods, you had persons of interest. I mean, I didn't have the database, but I saw people walking around who just shouldn't belong in those neighborhoods. So I decided to do an experiment. I had some business for one day in Poland. So I flew into Vienna on this year, January 1st. I landed at 5 in the morning, so I spent my New Year's Eve. My lovely wife doesn't know about it, but I spent my New Year's Eve on the plane. Landed in Vienna and started walking around, looking for squats. When you have squats marked Bourgie Raus and the anarchy sign, those are leftists. Leftist communists, Trotskyites, anarchists. And there you go. It was open, alter globalist haven for people from the Middle East. So you'd say, okay, they're ultra-globalists, they're tolerant, open-minded, blah, blah, blah. That's where they belong. But then I walked a little bit more, and remember, this is New Year's Eve. It means New Year's Day. So now, by now it was about 7 in the morning. Everybody was drunk out of his head. Nobody bothered you when you walk back and forth in the squats. And I go to squats. I went to neighborhoods which were marked 8-8. Who knows what that means? Heil Hitler. The 8th letter in the alphabet is H. Heil Hitler. So, neo-Nazis. There you go, visitors from the Middle East. There was Vienna. Same thing in Berlin. I went to Warsaw. Then I flew into Hamburg. Guess what they were staying in Hamburg? Not the squats. St. Pauli, the brothel part. Because you pay a hooker, you can sleep without registration. You don't show your passport. Yes. And they mingle freely. Why? Because the radicals, or either nationalist radicals or ultra-globalist radicals, want to destroy the system. They think this is the best battering ram. In Munich, they also stay in Brussels. Well, you know, if she has a client, you have to leave, but otherwise you can sleep. And this doesn't function publicly, because in the United States, we're also blind. When I delivered my speech about Russian active measures and disinformation, all brigade commanders, NATO brigade commanders, mostly Americans, came up to me and said, wow, this is for the first time that anybody came from Washington, D.C. who would tell us things straight. We never hear anything like this. Because we were heading to Ukraine. We sent our special forces to train, and I had to train them before they went. In any event, it's been fun. You've been a wonderful captive audience. Those of you who are asleep, bless you. This is exactly what I'd like to be doing. Thank you very much.
Okay, big round of applause for Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we have a couple of minutes to mingle by the bar if you want.
Be fruitful and multiply, and put your money where your mouth is. Long live the Commonwealth and freedom. Thank you.
I keep telling my wife we should multiply a little more, but she says no. Thank you.